When we speak about childhood solitude, our minds often leap toward concern. We imagine the lonely child on the playground, the one who doesn't raise their hand in class, who prefers books to birthday parties, or who lingers on the edges of group activities. There's a cultural reflex, almost instinctive, that equates being alone with something being wrong. But I want to start by gently inviting you to reconsider that assumption. Solitude in childhood is not always a problem to be solved. In fact, in many cases, it is a deeply important part of psychological development, one that deserves more understanding than suspicion. To understand solitude, we must begin by defining it not simply as the absence of social interaction, but as a space. A space where the self can exist without performance. A space where a child can meet their inner world, sometimes for the first time. This solitude is not about isolation or rejection. It is a quiet sanctuary, often chosen, often cherished. Some children are naturally drawn to this space. It's where their imaginations take root, where their questions about life begin to form, and where they begin, in subtle ways, to understand who they are when no one is watching. We must be careful, though. There is another side to this story. Not all solitude is chosen. Some children retreat because the world feels too loud, too unpredictable, or even too painful. Solitude, in this sense, can be a form of protection. It may come in response to bullying, rejection, neglect, or emotional overwhelm. This is not the same as the reflective, creative solitude I spoke of earlier. This is withdrawal, and while the two may look similar from the outside, a quiet child, a solitary moment, the emotional texture is vastly different. One is rooted in freedom, the other in fear. Still, many children fall somewhere in between. A child may seek time alone to recharge after social interaction, to daydream, or to process something difficult. These moments are not abnormal. In fact, they're essential. A child who is never left alone with their thoughts may struggle later to know their own mind, to trust their own instincts. In our fast-paced, hyper-connected world, we sometimes mistake constant stimulation for emotional health. But a child who knows how to sit quietly with themselves, who finds comfort in their own presence, holds a kind of quiet power that is often overlooked. In the early years, solitude often shows up in play. A young child builds elaborate worlds with blocks, talks to imaginary friends, draws for hours without seeking praise. These are not meaningless distractions. These are acts of self-expression, of internal organization. The child is building not just castles or creatures, but their inner architecture. They are learning how to self-soothe, how to create meaning, how to entertain and comfort themselves. This is foundational. As the child grows, solitude may begin to take on a different shape. The inner voice grows louder. Reflection becomes more complex. Emotions deepen. Some children may turn inward during times of confusion or stress, using solitude as a way to make sense of what they cannot yet explain aloud. And yet, adults often panic. We say, "Why are you always alone?" Or "Go outside and play with others." The message, however unintentional, is that their solitude is strange, perhaps even wrong. But let me say clearly, solitude is not a flaw. It is not something to fix or cure. It is a condition of depth. A child in solitude is not necessarily a child in danger. They may simply be exploring a dimension of being that the world rarely takes time to understand. And if we listen, truly listen, to what their solitude is saying, we might begin to see it not as a wall, but as a window. We need to reframe the conversation. Instead of asking why a child is alone, we might ask, what are they discovering in that aloneness? What are they creating? What are they learning about the world, about themselves? In solitude, many children find clarity, a sense of safety, even joy. They aren't broken. They are thinking, wondering, becoming. Of course, not every solitary child is at peace. We must remain attuned to signs of distress, depression, social anxiety, or trauma masked by withdrawal. But even then, the answer is not to force socialization, but to understand, to offer gentle invitations back to connection, not with urgency, but with empathy, to show that the door is open and that we're here when they're ready. And so, before we rush to label or redirect, let us pause. Let us observe with compassion and curiosity. Because in that pause, we may discover that what looks like absence is often a quiet, essential presence. The child in solitude may not be lost. They may be exactly where they need to be. There are children who, from the very beginning, move through the world in a way that seems different.
Not wrong.
Simply different. You might notice it in how they linger a little longer in thought before speaking, or how they withdraw from noisy crowds and prefer quieter corners. Some are drawn to deep questions, even at a young age. Others are acutely attuned to emotion, their own and everyone else's. These qualities are not merely shaped by their environment. They are reflections of something deeper, the temperament and personality with which a child comes into the world. Temperament is not something we teach. It is something we observe. It is the natural rhythm of a child's inner life, their baseline energy, their sensitivity to stimulation, their preferred ways of connecting with others. And when we begin to understand temperament, solitude starts to make more sense. Some children are simply wired to need more quiet, more reflection, more time alone. It is not a choice rooted in fear or sadness. It is a choice that aligns with who they are. Take, for example, the child who is introverted. Not shy in the sense of being afraid of people, but inwardly focused, energized by the internal world rather than the external one. This child may find group settings draining, not because they dislike others, but because their inner life is so rich and consuming that too much external input becomes overwhelming. After a social interaction, they may need solitude not to escape, but to recover. They step away to recharge, not to retreat. This is a vital distinction, and one that adults often overlook. Then there are the highly sensitive children, those who feel everything, light, sound, emotions, with heightened intensity. For them, solitude is often a sanctuary. In the stillness, they are not avoiding life, they are managing it. They are processing details that others might miss, integrating sensations that others filter out. Without this space, these children may become overstimulated, anxious, or even physically unwell. Yet too often, we interpret their quietness as a problem to be corrected, rather than a message to be understood. And let us not forget the emotionally intense children. Those who experience joy and sorrow in equally vivid measure. These children often require solitude to navigate the tidal waves of feeling that pass through them. In moments of reflection, they begin to name those feelings, to place them in context, to make meaning out of what might otherwise feel like chaos. Their solitude is a kind of emotional anchoring, a way of finding balance in a world that sometimes moves too fast for their hearts to keep up. These differences in temperament and personality are not weaknesses. They are seeds of potential. A child who prefers solitude may grow into an adult who is introspective, creative, deeply empathetic. But only if we make space for them to be who they are. Only if we stop trying to reshape them in the image of what society deems normal. What often happens is that we compare. We see the child who is loud, social, and confident, and we hold that child up as the ideal. The quiet one, the reflective one, is asked to speak more, join more, smile more. They are praised when they act against their nature and questioned when they don't. This is where the danger lies. Not in the child's solitude, but in our discomfort with it. We must learn to differentiate between solitude that nourishes and isolation that wounds. Temperament offers us the key. When a child's need for solitude flows from their natural disposition, it can be honored as a strength. It does not mean they are sad, lonely, or disconnected. It means they are following the contours of their own psyche, which is often more finely drawn than we realize. To support these children, we must offer more than just permission to be alone. We must offer understanding. We must speak their language, even if it is spoken in silence. We must protect their time to think, to imagine, to simply be. And when they do reach out, when they share their thoughts, their questions, their quiet joys, we must listen with the kind of attentiveness they offer so naturally to the world around them. In doing so, we begin to create a space where solitude is not mistaken for sadness, and where the inner life of the child is seen not as an escape, but as a place of deep and meaningful growth. And perhaps then, we can stop asking children to become more like others, and instead help them become more fully themselves. A child does not grow in isolation. Even the most solitary child is shaped by the world around them, by the rhythms of the home, the pulse of the schoolyard, the unspoken rules of the peer group, and the emotional atmosphere of the adults who care for them. Solitude, while often rooted in temperament, is also deeply influenced by the environment in which the child is placed. This interplay between the inner and outer worlds can either nurture the child's solitude or distort it into something far more painful. Let us begin with the family, the first mirror in which the child sees themselves reflected. If this mirror is cracked, if there is emotional neglect, unpredictability, or constant tension, the child may begin to retreat inward, Not out of preference, but as a form of self-preservation. Silence becomes their shield. In these cases, solitude is not chosen but constructed as a wall, a barrier against a world that feels unsafe or indifferent. A child may learn very early on that speaking their truth leads to conflict, or that vulnerability invites rejection. So they stop reaching out. They withdraw, not because they are naturally solitary, but because the environment has taught them that connection is costly. On the other hand, a family that honors emotional expression, respects boundaries, and offers consistent warmth can help a child feel safe enough to move between solitude and connection with ease. In such a space, a child's desire to be alone is not viewed as disrespect or dysfunction. It is respected as part of who they are. This kind of environment allows solitude to flourish as a healthy process, one that supports emotional integration rather than avoidance. But family is only the beginning. School becomes the second major environment where solitude is either affirmed or misunderstood. The modern classroom, often built around group work, participation, and extroverted engagement, can unintentionally exclude the child who prefers to observe before speaking, or who finds meaning in solitary reflection. These children are often labeled as disengaged, disinterested, or even oppositional. Not because they are, but because they don't fit the expected mold. The problem is not with the child, it is with the expectation. Teachers and educators hold great power here. A single adult who sees the quiet child not as a puzzle to be solved, but as a soul to be understood, can shift the trajectory of that child's self-perception. A quiet student who is given space, who is asked thoughtful questions, rather than pressured to perform, can begin to understand their own rhythm as valid. They learn they do not need to shout to be heard. They learn that stillness has value. And then, of course, there are the peers. Children do not exist outside of social hierarchies. They are constantly scanning for cues: who is accepted, who is praised, who is ridiculed. In peer groups, the solitary child often finds themselves misunderstood. They may be excluded because they don't follow the dominant script. Or worse, they may be targeted for their difference. Bullying is not always loud. Sometimes it is subtle. The absence of invitations, the averted gaze, the silence that follows when they enter the room. This peer rejection can turn chosen solitude into painful loneliness. A child who once found peace in their own company may begin to doubt themselves, to question their worth, to believe that they are invisible. The message they receive is clear: being different is dangerous. So they either push themselves into inauthentic connection, which exhausts them, or they retreat so deeply that they forget how to come back. We must recognize how sensitive children are to their environments, not only emotionally, but existentially. They are always asking, even if only silently, is it safe to be myself here? Do I belong? Can I be both solitary and loved? The environments we build, at home, at school, in friendship, answer those questions long before the child learns how to ask them aloud. The truth is, no child's solitude exists in a vacuum. It is touched by every word they hear, every space they enter, every response they receive when they dare to be themselves. If we want to understand the psychology of childhood solitude, we must look not only at the child but at the world they inhabit. We must ask what they are responding to, what they are adapting to. Because sometimes, solitude is not about what the child wants, but what they are trying to survive. So we must look not only within the child, but around them. And in that reflection, we may begin to see how the world shapes silence, just as much as it shapes speech. There is a kind of quiet that nourishes a child, and there is a kind of quiet that hollows them out. Understanding the emotional and cognitive impact of solitude requires us to step into that stillness, not to interrupt it, but to listen, to really see what's happening beneath the surface. Because solitude is never just the absence of sound or company. It is a space where the mind and heart begin to speak to each other more clearly. And depending on how that space is shaped, what unfolds within it can either help a child grow or cause them to retreat further into themselves. When solitude is healthy, it becomes a place of integration. A child steps away from the noise of the world, and in doing so, begins to piece together their experiences, their emotions, their questions. They are not doing nothing. They are doing the vital work of making sense of things. In this space, a thought that felt too jumbled in the moment can become clear. A feeling that was overwhelming can soften and become nameable. This is the quiet where emotional regulation begins to take root, where creativity begins to stir, where inner strength is built slowly, like the deepening of roots below the soil. For some children, this solitude becomes the birthplace of imagination. It is where stories are formed, where new worlds are built in their minds, where they begin to shape not just how they see the world, but how they might one day contribute to it. These children are not avoiding life, they are digesting it. They are practicing empathy, complexity, often without a single word spoken aloud. And if we watch closely, we will see signs of that inner work spilling over into the outer world, sometimes in the form of a drawing, a quiet insight, a sudden burst of understanding that seems to appear from nowhere. But it didn't come from nowhere. It came from solitude. This kind of solitude supports not only cognitive development, but emotional depth. A child who is given space to sit with their feelings without pressure to explain or dismiss them learns something essential: that feelings are not dangerous. That sadness can be felt without falling apart. That joy can arise unprovoked. That confusion can exist alongside curiosity. These are not just emotional lessons. They are life skills. The ability to be with oneself without needing distraction or external validation is a powerful foundation for resilience. But this is only one side of the story. Because solitude, when it is not chosen or supported, can tip into something very different. It can become a vacuum where difficult thoughts go unchecked, where self-doubt festers, where fear takes up residence. When a child feels alone not by preference but by exclusion, when they are isolated, unheard, or misunderstood, solitude becomes a breeding ground for anxiety. The same stillness that once felt safe begins to feel heavy. Thoughts loop without relief. Emotions become sharper, more painful, and less nameable. In such solitude, the mind may begin to turn against itself. A child may start to believe that their aloneness is proof that something is wrong with them. They may internalize rejection, assume fault, and begin to hide parts of themselves, not just from others, but from their own awareness. What begins as silence becomes shame. What begins as solitude becomes suffering. The distinction between healing solitude and harmful isolation is subtle, but crucial. It lies not only in whether the child is alone, but how they feel in that aloneness. Do they return from it lighter or heavier? Do they emerge with more clarity or more confusion? Are they using solitude to return to themselves, or to escape from a world that refuses to see them? This is where our attention must go. Not to the mere fact of solitude, but to its texture. How does the child seem when they are alone? Are they curious, engaged, thoughtful? Or are they anxious, withdrawn, listless? We must learn to read the emotional signature of their solitude. We must listen to the silence not just with our ears, but with our intuition. When solitude supports development, it is a place where thought and feeling find each other. When it becomes a prison, those same elements turn on themselves. The same mind that could create becomes stuck. The same sensitivity that could deepen empathy becomes a source of pain. This is why we must never assume that solitude means the same thing for every child. Its impact depends on so many things: the child's temperament, their past experiences, the presence or absence of emotional safety around them. So, it is not enough to ask whether a child is alone. We must ask, what are they carrying with them into that aloneness? What are they finding there? And most importantly, what are they bringing back when they return? Sometimes, the most profound questions a child asks are not spoken aloud. They show up in the pauses, in the long stares out of windows, in the quiet choices to be alone rather than to follow the crowd. Solitude, when experienced in childhood, is more than a temporary state. It is often a doorway into the deeper realms of the psyche. In this space, the child doesn't merely rest from the world. They begin to explore the early stages of self-awareness, identity, and meaning. They begin to wonder, not always consciously, but intuitively, who am I when no one is looking? What does it mean to feel the way I do? What is my place in all of this? These are not small questions. They are the early signals of an inner life beginning to form its own language. In solitude, the child meets themselves. Not the self they perform for parents or teachers or friends, but the self that exists even in silence, the self that dreams, that reflects, that feels strange and separate, and yet deeply alive. This encounter, though subtle, is one of the most essential movements of psychological development. It is the seat of individuality. Much of what we call identity begins here. Not in the loud moments of self-declaration, but in the quiet rehearsals that happen when no one is watching. The child in solitude imagines who they might become, tries on different roles in thought, pictures futures not yet spoken aloud. They are shaping a sense of self not imposed from outside, but emerging from within. This is not an escape from the world. It is the beginning of engaging with it on their own terms, and meaning, too, often arises from these moments. A child may not yet have the words for it, but in solitude, they begin to ask the larger questions. Why do people act the way they do? Why do I feel different? What is real and what is only pretending? These are not academic curiosities. They are the early stirrings of a philosophical mind, a search for coherence in a world that is often confusing. Even the act of reflecting on one's day, on what was felt, what was missed, what was misunderstood, can be an act of meaning-making. It's in this quiet reflection that children begin to connect events to emotions, emotions to needs, and needs to deeper truths. In many cases, these insights remain unspoken. A child may never tell anyone what they are thinking about in their solitude. They may not even be able to articulate it yet. But the thoughts take root. They shape how the child sees themselves and the world. They begin to develop an internal compass, a sense of what feels right or wrong, what feels real or false, what feels like home, and what feels like exile. And this compass becomes vital in later life. Without it, the individual drifts. With it, they navigate even complex emotional terrain with a sense of inner guidance. Yet modern life often pulls children away from this inner exploration. We fill every hour with structured activity. We reward performance over introspection. We rush them through emotions, through experiences, through their very becoming. In doing so, we risk cutting them off from the space where true self, knowledge can emerge. We must understand that solitude is not a void to be filled, but a space to be respected. It is where many of life's most important questions first arise, not in conversation, but in contemplation. Some of the most creative, insightful, and emotionally attuned individuals began as children who spent time alone, not because they were excluded, but because they were listening inward, listening for a sense of meaning that could not be handed to them, only discovered. These are the children who may struggle to explain what they feel, but who carry a sense of depth in their presence. They are not empty. They are in formation. This is why we must not only allow solitude but protect it. It is not a delay in development. It is part of development. In solitude, the child learns to hold questions rather than rush to answers. They learn that they are not defined solely by what others see. They begin to claim something deeply personal, the right to their own experience, their own rhythm, their own becoming. We must meet them in that space, not with noise, not with judgment, but with reverence. Because the child sitting quietly in the corner may be doing the most important work of all, beginning to understand who they truly are. There comes a time when solitude, once a gentle companion in childhood, becomes misunderstood, even feared, by the adults in a child's life. The quiet child becomes the subject of concern. Why don't they talk more? Why don't they join in? Should we encourage them to be more social? These questions, though often well-meaning, miss a deeper truth. For children whose solitude is part of their nature, part of their emotional rhythm and psychological structure, the goal is not to fix them, but to support them in becoming more fully themselves. And to do that, we must learn not just to observe from the outside, but to accompany them from within, with presence, patience, and a willingness to see the world through their eyes. Support begins not with intervention, but with acceptance. There is profound power in saying, without expectation or pressure, you are fine just as you are. For the solitary child, this message is essential. They must feel, at a deep and embodied level, that their way of being is not a defect to overcome, but a way of relating to life that is equally valid, equally meaningful. Only from this foundation of emotional safety can they begin to engage with the world on their own terms. Sometimes quietly, sometimes slowly, but always authentically. This kind of support does not require constant engagement. It requires attunement. The adult who truly sees the child will know when to lean in and when to give space. They will recognize when the child's silence is full and thoughtful, and when it is heavy and burdened. They will know that solitude, when respected, becomes a space where the child gathers strength, and that sometimes, simply sitting beside them in that space, without speaking, is the greatest act of care. To support the solitary child means making space for depth. It means asking better questions. Not the kind that pressure them into performance, but the kind that invite reflection, instead of, "Why don't you play with the others?" Perhaps, What kinds of things do you enjoy thinking about when you're by yourself? These questions signal that we are interested not only in their behaviors, but in their inner life, that we value what is happening beneath the surface. And just as important as what we say is what we allow. We must allow slowness. We must allow moments of quiet without rushing to fill them. We must allow the child to come forward in their own time, rather than pulling them toward us. These acts of allowance are not passive. They are powerful. They tell the child that their rhythm is respected, that their silence is not a void but a vessel. Support also means creating environments that are not hostile to solitude. Classrooms, homes, and public spaces often reward extroversion. Group projects, social activities, noise, and speed dominate much of a child's external world. We must offer balance. We must carve out protected spaces, places where solitude is not only allowed, but encouraged. A quiet reading corner, a walk through nature, unstructured time with no agenda. These spaces are not indulgences. They are essentials for certain children, the ground upon which they build themselves. But support does not mean overprotection. The solitary child, like any child, will face challenges. They may struggle with being misunderstood, with moments of loneliness, with the push and pull between their need for quiet and the demands of a loud world. We must help them meet these challenges without asking them to become someone they are not. The goal is not to make them more social or more outspoken, but more self-aware, more emotionally resilient, more equipped to navigate life as the person they are. This involves teaching them the language of their own experience. We can help them name their feelings, understand their preferences, and recognize their limits. We can show them that solitude is not isolation, and that they can reach out when needed without betraying their nature. We can help them understand that their inner world is a strength, and that the same stillness that allows them to reflect can also allow them to connect, deeply, meaningfully, and in their own way. Above all, we must model what it looks like to honor silence, to listen without interrupting, to value stillness, to be comfortable in the presence of another without always needing words. In doing so, we give the child something rare and transformative, the sense that they are not alone, even in their solitude. Because the truth is, the solitary child does not need to be brought out of themselves. They need to be met where they are, with gentleness, with wisdom, and with the quiet confidence that who they are is already enough.